for Andrew and David. Please welcome Clancy Moore with Andrew. Thank you.
Uh, Thanks, Amelia. Yeah, apologies about the weather, and apologies I'm here on my own. Colum's over, but he's unwell. So we are two. And so this slideshow sort of represents two sets of interests, and I'll be talking about that as we go through it. But probably just by way of introduction to the talk, we're, as a practice, very interested in the kind of unspoken aspect of architecture. And by unspoken, we mean embodied, like that there is an aspect of architectural knowledge that is physically contained in a human body. And we understand this in the sense that if any of you are asked to make work on your own or as a group, you will make something different than another group given the same question. You will look at the world slightly differently. And we also recognize it in the feeling that we have when an architect dies, because this is a form of knowledge that is not transmittable, is not replicable. Ours is not a form of knowledge that you can contain in books. The books are symptoms. They help generate the knowledge, but the knowledge is fundamentally cited in human form. And so we're very interested in this, the subjectivities, the tensions, the kind of problems that that produces. We might start, because we're in Caesar land, that's trademarked, I believe, with this sketch, which is a sketch I love. And Caesar has come to London. He's been asked to make an exhibition for the Royal Academy, and he's a bit bored. He doesn't really like the site they've given, and he's sitting at a table away from the curator. And I know this because the curator was very annoyed. She wanted to talk with him, and he just went somewhere else and was doing drawings. And there's a sketchbook full of these drawings. But I love this one in particular because Caesar's drawing this courtyard, and the page that we're looking at of the notebook is full of the drawing, but on the foreground in front of us, there's a table and the page of the notebook is empty. And so the sketchbook on the table is this sketchbook just as he started making the drawing. And so the sketch isn't about physically looking at the courtyard. It's about the time that you need to be present somewhere to see something. And so the sketch is about seeing, and seeing a context. And here we see a context that contains physical things, high architecture. It contains inhabitation, people coming and going. It contains temporary architecture, umbrellas and things. And it contains part of the body of the architect, his hand. And what we're interested in too then is that we're a contextual architecture practice. We think all practices are. We kind of laugh at, say, Algiati talking about non-referential architecture. This is hilarious to us. It's like stupid, because that is probably the most referential statement an architect can make. Oh, I have no references. Well, okay, we'll talk about your insecurities later. But we are all contextual. We are all reference-based, reference-born. We build our lives in the spaces we inhabit, and they go forward with us. And the architect is part, physically embodied, in the sites they operate on. And that should be comfortable to you, that when you're taken to a site, when you're brought to a site, you are physically part of that site. You are emotionally part of that site. And the site's different because you're there. This is another image that we like to talk about a lot. Okay, so it's a kind of a beautiful image, but both Colm and I teach, so I basically head up a department of architecture in London, in Kingston, and Colm heads up a course in Belfast. And we tend to use this as a way of starting a conversation with students. And this is an image by an English painter, Joseph Wright, and it's an image of an alchemist, Henning Brandt. And those of you who probably know a bit about alchemy, it's the precursor to chemistry, really. It was a belief-based, potion-oriented process in search for things like eternal life, in search of things like the philosopher's stone, right? And they did amazing things like trying to distill their urine, their body parts, other things to make elixirs, right? This Alchemist Henning Brandt has made these incredible series of equipment, and he's been distilling a mixture of 40 liters of his own urine that he collected over several months because he thought he could find the essential qualities of life. And he's excited because the vial has started to glow, and he feels like something's happening. And what he's done is he's actually, for the first time, chemically isolated phosphorus. He's invented modern chemistry, and he's killed alchemy. And he's excited, and he's about to be very badly injured because phosphorus obviously burns in contact with oxygen, and he's about to burn himself. And for us, this conversation speaks of two things. One is the frustration and joy of architectural process. We're a belief-oriented discipline. I ask any of you to make a building, you start to design it. It's quite interesting. How can you start designing unless you know what it is you're trying to make? And yet we do that all the time. We conflate and we imagine and we inhabit mental landscapes, and then they physically change the world, right? We find that really amazing, and it's full of frustrations. It's full of moments where you realize you're so wrong. You're about to get burnt by phosphorus. And it's full of moments of amazing elation and frustration and tiredness and strange studios. And it's a place, I think, where the discipline hasn't talked enough about that. Those feelings are natural feelings. They're the feeling of being an architect. They're essential for you to understand and to own, because without them, there's no architecture. And so we also love this image because we also like to remind people that architecture too was being invented at exactly this time. I mean, people think that architecture is millennia old. The symptoms of architecture are they exist for as long as humans have made spaces to live in. But architecture as a discipline only was invented about 400 years ago. We're super young. And it's a super radical thing that happened, which is that architecture was always connected to something else. It was with the Masons Guild, or the religious orders, or ascendancy power structures, kings and lords. It was always linked to the world. Like if you read Alberti, there's an awful lot about behaviors in the world, and you're not really only doing buildings. If you read Vitruvius even, it's the same thing, where they're not recognizable to us as architects today. The idea that you would remove this thing, distill it from its essential contingency and make a pure form of it disconnected from the world is radical. Making a school of architecture is radical. That's how it was first done. They disconnected it from the guilds, disconnected it from belief-based systems, and made a school. It wasn't a great school, it was the École des Beaux-Arts, but schools currently reoccur, and I think it's worth thinking about a discipline that didn't exist now with 3 million people in the world who call themselves architects, over 3,500 schools of architecture. More of the built environment of the world being designed by architects than at any point in human history. More architects as a percentage of the population doing a wider diversity of roles than at any point in human history. And yet we're in as a discipline, we're continually critical of our lack of agency, of our inability to control the world. And that, I tell you, is because we have become general practitioners. We're not hierarchically removed from society on a pedestal, controlling by command and control. We're enmeshed in culture, like Henning Brandt is in his studio. We are much closer to the contingency of human life, much closer to chance, much closer to economic forces. Architecture today doesn't get its agency by you telling someone what to do. It gets its agency by you generating a conversation and inflecting and negotiating others to a position that isn't even your own. Does that make sense? So unfortunately, I'm not able to advance the slides because every time I get close, it feedbacks. But this is what we're interested in. So for us, architecture is made always in relationships. Carlos Scarpa said this about materials and joints, and we agree with that, we love that. But it's also fundamentally made in relationships. human relationships, conversations, people that you meet, the people in the room in your studio, whether you're the boss or you're the employee, the room should be different because you're in it. And that's what we're fundamentally invested in. And then we're invested in that conversation become embodied in the work in some way. And we started our practice the way a lot of people do. We didn't make a decision, but the world asked us to do something. So we were working for an office that we didn't really like, and a family member had been trying to get planning permission for his children in a place, and he'd been through 4 architects, and he just sort of fed up. So I'll ask these guys. And so we started a practice without even knowing it. And our first project was this house for this family in a quarry outside Dublin, a place. All of our early jobs were jobs discarded by other architects. This is normally how it starts. And normally how it works is that you seem to have a naive self-belief that you will get through that in some way. And so this is the site. On the right, there's a quarry. You see the image on the lower point of that quarry is 30 meters above where the house is, and then the slope continues to drop to the left. And what we did was we made the building so that it would make a room for the family, and then that the building would sit around that. And it was 12 years ago, 14 years ago, so we wanted to make a building that was carbon neutral, so we made it in mass timber. And there's no mass timber industry in Ireland, so both of those lengths of the houses are governed by the exact length of the containers that could take the timber to Ireland from Austria. But the whole, I could go on, but every aspect of this project is governed by dimensions and forces completely not ours. All we did was negotiate them. And we were thinking about places apart. This is Lambay Island. This is a place in Dublin where a divorced couple from London, fleeing scandal, made this place for themselves with the architect Edwin Lutyens. It's probably one of the masterpieces of the 20th century. It's almost completely unknown, but what's amazing about it is 2 things. One is these figures in the site of courtyards and towers and bastions, and then this great figure in this very wild landscape of a circle drawn in the ground and a romantic garden planted in it. And we were thinking of figure and ground, the figure of space held and space displaced, the figure of something recognized, of affinities and emotional relationships, of things that look like other things, or people, or memories. We were interested in the figure of compression, of trying to make purity from fundamentally disordered things. At the time, we were attracted to a kind of abstracted form of practice that was trying to make, I suppose, pure geometrical figures, and we were attracted to the French hotel plan in thinking about this. But in the quarry, I'll just skip on before I come back. Colin put these slides together, he's bold. But we don't have a lot of space to play. So you see the facade to the left is held by an offset to a river that feeds the reservoir that makes this valley so beautiful. And the one on the right-hand side is held by the light that comes over the quarry wall. So the plan of the project is one of infrastructure, of looking at a plan, trying to find a way to inhabit it, and then making rooms from that. So the interiors are kind of soft and inflected around poche spaces and kind of classically ordered spaces, but the exterior is very much opportunistic. Because the ground was so disordered from the work of the quarry, it only touches the ground in 4 places. It's the only horizontal line in the landscape, this building. And then so that the architecture is very much to do with making this bridge for you to live in, and then that you can work through, so that on the right we have the quarry's south light coming over onto your veranda, into the living spaces, and then the bedrooms out facing towards Dublin below you. And then there's another quarry below the site, so the end of it sticks out over that lower quarry. And what's quite interesting is that when we started, we were interested in abstraction, but the house, because it was made in timber, started to move. So we started to have to make linings and things like this, and we began to work with the language of architecture, which at the time to us was quite threatening, I think, because it felt conservative, but actually it was a way to understand detailing. And then the house got finished, and there was a conversation where Ellis Woodman visited the house, a critic from London, and it's the first time somebody had seen our work from the architectural critical knowledge base, and he pointed at this moment, these two doors, and he said, this is the whole project. And what he meant was that in the figure of these two doors, we see the story of the mass timber structure, the spans, the structure that makes one door taller and smaller. I won't go into that, that's just the structure of the house. And then us trying to deal with it by linings. And it's almost possible for the whole landscape, the whole history of the design of the project, our relationships with the clients, for us to be present in this figure. Nobody else can read it. But it has an empathetic potential, and we're interested in moments where architectural decisions become explicitly present, when the system is broken by the human intelligence to do it. It was quite interesting, in the review that Ellis wrote, he talked about an architect that we loved, but that we didn't think we had an affinity with in our work, but it was Alejandro de la Sota. And he said that Clancy Moore's work, like we had all these other unbuilt projects at the time which were looking for purity. They were square plans, circular plans, the kind of things that you would see quite commonly. And he said it's interesting, all of Clancy Moore's other work is this search for purity, but this house is a control of multiple contingencies, and it doesn't feel like architecture at all. It feels like infrastructure. And we were really excited about that. Initially really confused, like, is that good? But then the more we thought about it, the more we thought about how infrastructure enables other things to happen. And we thought, well, what if architecture was thought of as infrastructure? It isn't the foreground thing, it's the thing that makes this happen. This is a handrail from De La Sota, which we just use as a memento. But what we're talking about is people thinking about architecture as enabling infrastructures, and that allowed us a liberation to deal with contingencies. Here, multiple contingencies to do with landscape and planning that I won't bore you with. Most of the things we do are, so the Quarry houses they were a new building, there was no building there before, but even they felt like an adjustment, an extension. They didn't feel like autonomous. And I have a question in my mind about an awful lot of architectural training which sets out purity of conceptual intention as being a fundamental knowledge system for architects. Yeah, maybe if you're doing monuments, or if your clients are super wealthy, or if you are doing huge institutions, yeah, maybe, but even then, maybe not. The world is so densely inhabited, so densely imagined, so heavily contested, that we think negotiation, emergent sense from found conditions, is a much more valuable skill for architects. And so a lot of the frustration of our discipline is about people seeking to impose top-down in a world that wants to be understood bottom-up. There's no lack of control for the architect in this switch. It's just a judo move. You just get comfortable with change and your ability to be faster in understanding that change. This is a small house that is stuck to the back of another house. What we're interested in these moments was like thinking about the relationships of things. What happens when you're thinking about additions and inflections is that things are always understood in relationship to the things that are already there and the things that you're bringing together. And there are moments in our practice where things became explicit to us. Like one was this column that supports the roof, which then hangs the seat, which then sits on a base below. And this is a house for an actor who's very sociable, very well known. There's a single room at the bottom for him to learn his lines, and then there's a theatrical space above, which is where people sit together. But that's not really the metaphor of the project. For us, the metaphor of the project is thinking about assembly, thinking about what goes where, what touches, what doesn't, how that sets up space, and how that allows us to react. And what we found with this was that there was an awful lot of tolerance. So this was a contested area where people kept changing the design, the planners and others, but keeping this relationship in our mind of the hanging rod, the window, and the column allowed us to understand the project wasn't its shape. The project was the feeling that the shape came from. And this is another project that explored the same thing, which is about it's a 16th century walled garden, and we are asked to put a house at the intersection of in the garden. And so we placed it at the intersection of the surrounding fields, the two walled gardens, and sitting across it. And then making a series of layers through the existing walls based on water and roof forms. And this was one of the projects that died when Ireland went into, well, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland went into really deep recessions. Ireland was the worst, weirdly, but you didn't hear about it so badly. But basically everything died, everything stopped. But this was really interesting because and it stopped for about 5 years. But this was really interesting to us because it was on our boards. It was the last thing, and it kind of hung around in our mind, thinking about things set apart and things held together. And we did a PhD, and during the PhD, this is one of the observations that one of our tutors made, which was about seeking coherence, or what they called the Western interpretation. This is Tony Fretton, where, say, a handrail is going up a stairs and going to a landing, and that you might place the upright at the point of join. And then what he terms the Eastern, which is that you actually place off the join. You let the decision become explicit and a figure emerges. Something more ambiguous, maybe more beautiful, certainly easier to make. And so this was something then that when the practice started to get moving again, all of our work has been extensions and inflections. And this is a house, the existing is in red. And they had that kind of interesting question, which is that they wanted a big room to live in with no walls, and then they wanted walls so that they didn't have to hear each other all the time. This kind of usual thing. And so what we did is they didn't have a lot of money, so we said that, look, upstairs the plan needs to be supported. It runs down that dotted line you see in the middle of the plan in the black. So the first thing we did on the site was place a column in the middle of it. And this plan here is derived from our search for purity, this kind of search for square plans. It's the last one we made. This is, for example, an artist studio that we had made pre the recession, the kind of thing that we were chasing. But in the plan for the artist studios, the rooms are placed in this pinwheel fashion. We're chasing kind of very ordered space that make a singular whole, and they kind of dictate the form together. But in this one, the plan actually came last. What started it was the idea of how we would prop the existing structure, how we would make new walls and old. And so the existing house is bearing across the plan, and we needed to make a prop for this. As I say, this is one of Column's sections, so apologies because this is his stuff. But in the middle of it, there was a column to support that, and then we needed to carve it to make roof lights. So we made these kind of plasterboard vaults that would float overhead. And this was interesting to us because it allowed us to have other conversations, yeah, sure, with like Scarpa or Jörnitzen or other friends of the practice. Like, what we love about architecture is that, you know, when you're in a building and the architect isn't there, or maybe they're dead, and suddenly you smile. They have you somewhere. And we like that conversation with reference. We like talking about reference like old men in pubs in Scorsese movies talk about boxers. Because it is that. It's not other, it's very human. It's like, oh, did you like the way they did that? Not so much, but God, I like the way they did that. And it's kind of this thing about those stories becoming present in the houses we work in then becomes part of the conversation with the clients. And we make all of this very transparent. One of the things that emerged in this house, and it came from the walled garden house, was the idea of the layered nature of the wall. I mean, this is a wall painting from the house of Homer in Pompeii. And this idea of space being contained in a single surface, and paint being a layer, and architecture not necessarily needing to be confused about that layering is something that's very exciting about contemporary tectonics. And so the whole house is made of us breaking down the traditional cavity wall so that each layer of it has its presence within the space. Everything is slipped off relative to everything else. So on the image on the left, you see the inner leaf of the cavity wall still there, and then the outer leaf brought back. And then light falling between these things. Somewhere halfway between a ruin and a tent, and then it's nice to live there. And we do like the way that this kind of thinking can just absorb life, absorb things, and we have this kind of thing that we're quite proud of, which is that most of our clients hire us to do more than one thing. And this is the column that started it all, the prop in the center of the plan. And like, obviously this is a sort of a strange thing to do. And like, when you're talking about things, like, we did talk about leverance, and I'm not going to go into leverance. Those of you who know Clip-On will know this image. This kind of really amazing moment in the church where the roof is held up like an expanded rib cage, and then the imagery of the cross. And it felt at a time too potent a reference to be making. But then when we were in Clip-On, we went around the corner and there was a barn that was there before the church. And maybe Leverance was lighthearted about his references too. And maybe we're always picking up information. Maybe we're always analysing things and absorbing it intuitively. And maybe that's just how to play with architecture. This is another house based around a column. Again, you can see the situation where there's a return above. We had to make an extension below, and so we prop it at the corner of the house, and then we carve out this space for light in the middle of it. You can see the column there in the center of the plan, and then held by these roof lights. What we were very interested in here was how something additive can transform the whole. So even though we only added 9 square meters, everything else was kind of cannibalizing through the house. And we love this way that architecture, just by changing something, you change the whole thing. And then how something here, we were very eager that this suburban house might feel like it's pavilion-like in the round. Like, what's commonly a problem with these types of works is that you can't get light deep in plan, and so the whole house was based on getting light from all around, even though you're in a terrace. And this is that moment where the column is reaching up to support the return, and then we drop these veils because there's all these different ceiling heights because we're dealing with the existing house condition. And the screen's not being kind to the drawing, but that's okay, because this is the column, and then you can just see the corner of the existing house arriving to the left, but then we've eroded that out of the bedroom so you're able to get the light across into it, and then everything becomes a dance from that point. And again, this was something kind of hard fought. It was like quite an odd thing. The first decision was the column, and then there was a bay window that needed to be removed, and then we just kept drawing bay windows. And then suddenly we were thinking about Van Eyck, and like, we hadn't really thought about Van Eyck or structuralism. And then the rhyme of it made fun, and it made us kind of joyous, and we thought a little bit about Caesar. And so the whole thing became a game for us. And we're always chasing these kind of figurative essences. I mean, this is a piece actually by Aldo van Eyck called Ahoy. And it's this kind of figurative stacking of frames held by bunting. The bunting is actually the tensile forces that are supporting it. And it's become a kind of a totem for us in understanding how something can be serious, systematic, and joyous all at the same time. Yeah, and the house has multiple layers, multiple facades. So this is another bay window back into another space. And then it meets the garden. And what's interesting for us in all of this is that a lot of the things you're doing in your life as an architect, certainly until my age and probably a little bit older, is that you're fighting very hard for knowledge that comes slowly. Things don't come easy to you. You remember it in first year or in college, the project that just never starts, or you keep drawing the same thing over and over again. And that's not because you're bad, it's because you are addressing something for the first time. And it takes a long time to lay down that knowledge. And then when it's laid down, you can pull on it fast. You can pull on it really fast. So slow projects that are hard tend to be the ones that release fast projects that are good. So like, this is something that came straight from that house. This is 30 social housing units in Dublin, but it comes right straight from the figure of that scheme and that column. And we were able to do this project much quicker because of the issues of the other one. And then all of the work that's forming our thinking at the moment is coming, it's work that sort of has sat now probably about 4 years ago. Like, we're in a different stage of the practice now. But all of the work post the recession was almost no budget, no skilled builders, and then trying to work with that context. And this is one, it's a warehouse where the client had 150,000 euros and they wanted to make a house out of it. And so we couldn't change any of the exterior, and the structure was incredibly weak. And the roof was just too low for you to get 2 floors comfortably using conventional construction. The only way you could get them was if the floor between the 2 levels was 75 millimeters thick, which meant that the floor had to have almost no span. Like, it could only go a couple of meters. So to get the house to work, we had to make a lot of columns, which are cheap, and walls, which are almost as cheap. And so the whole house became an exercise in columns and walls, to carve out and prop a very thin floor plate, to make a series of screens, because the plan of the house is such that there's 2 existing trusses running horizontally across the plan, so you couldn't get from one 2-story space to another in the house without crossing through those beams, and then the house wouldn't work. So we had to have 2 houses, 2 2-story elements, one at the bottom facing the street and one at the top facing the garden. The one at the top, the upstairs, is for the adults, and the one at the bottom is for the children. And then we thought about the living room in the middle like a town square, like that this was the first thing of civic space in this family, and then that would become part of their relationship to the city. So that civic space is made with facades and stairs and columns, and they're arranged in a kind of choreography. And when we talk about choreography, we're interested in that word, and we're also interested in the older Greek word choreography, which is the understanding through your actions of a place, of a territory, and the placing of things relative to one another. And this was something that was in our mind about, yeah, sure, we're thinking about people obviously like Shinohara, and we're thinking about people like this, but we're also thinking about just the limits of architectural skill, our building skill in our country, and working very precisely with things that we know can be done. And this is one of the interesting things about architecture, is translation of idea, translation of form. The tectonic is always a source of reinvention, I find. And I think when we look at architecture globally now, I think the climate crisis is fundamentally transforming architectural knowledge. And I'm interested in sustainability, obviously, ethically, but I'm also very interested in it because I think globally we're at a moment akin to Chicago at the late 19th century, or the Renaissance, where typology, form, and tectonics, they're not working for us anymore. And we need to dream it all up again. And I think that what's happening in the work that's happening in practice, a lot of the practices that are here, but also have taught here before, but in global practice, is a re-engagement with lightness, with layeredness, with the frugality and the essential qualities. And it's producing new territorial architectural languages. And so architecture is fundamentally reconnecting with meaning, with cause and effect. Sorry, this is a really difficult place to talk, but yeah. And that's just that. And so then it becomes a kind of a town hall for this family. And this is another totem for the practice, and it's early one morning, which is an amazing work of art, obviously. It's the first sculpture not placed on a plinth. And it's obviously justifiably really celebrated. But the artist, when he made it, was living in a small garage, and this was the exact dimension of that garage. So when you see the long beam running top to bottom, that was the length of it. The height of it is the sheet of steel. So he was operating within the limits of the space that he could find, and then much of it was salvaged from skips and other materials around. Well, the bigger sections weren't, but the smaller sections were salvaged. And so this idea that architecture, or that critical thinking or creative thinking, isn't bounded by its limits, but somehow by thinking about limits in a positive way, languages can be found, and that beauty can be found. We think that this is a way to think about architecture, that the limits that are consistently placed on us are actually a source of profound joy. This was a temporary project, that 3 of us were asked to make small things in London for some festival, and it seemed like a really strange thing to do, like that I would do a little pavilion over here, and my friend would do a little pavilion over here, and what's it all about? Like, oh, somebody might like it, but you're not going to get any work. And there's this really interesting thing about architecture, which is that the thing we wrap ourselves around a lot is esteem. Boy, do we love a little bit of praise and esteem and to be seen. I get it. I do feel that too. I don't think it's very useful, though. I think it makes us make bad decisions. Like in this case, they were really pushing for us to each do our own thing. And we were just like, no, we're just going to do something together, and you can forget about our names because that's not really important. We just want to put the budget together to make our first public building, because in Ireland, the procurement laws are so difficult that you actually can't get public work. And so this festival was a chance for us to make a public space. And so what we thought about was, how do we get architects to collaborate? And we became really interested in group work, the reference as a way to share, but also the conversation. And what we're interested in is, like, if I come to a table and I tell you I've got an amazing idea, if I want to collaborate with you, say Rodrigo, and I go, Rodrigo, I've got an amazing idea, this is it. There's no on for us. There's no moment that we can move beyond that without an argument. Because I've presented perfection, any diminishment of that perfection is a critique. Binary bullshit, right? Architecture's riddled with it. Not because we're bad, but because we don't talk about this. If I place an idea on the table and I point out its weaknesses, and somebody else affirms some strengths and adds extra strengths, then you have a conversation. Architecture, the really powerful practices, the really powerful work, works in conversation with clients, with sites, with other architects, with their design teams. And this was the rule that we made, which is that when you put an idea on the table, you could only point out its weaknesses, that we would accept every idea, and that the building would be collaged from those ideas. So it was an exercise in public space, an exercise in the arcade, the market hall, the park bench, snugs and pub, illicit public space where people might sneak away to do drinking in the evening, staircases, things where you bump into people, infrastructure, sewerage, and we just put them all together in a big collage. And so this is an arcade, which is thinking about that relationship. It's thinking about the facade as a public space, a very shallow public space, thinking about sewer pipes, the infrastructure that makes a city. Is thinking then about a market hall, about places for people to be together, and then a bench for people to be more intimately together above. And what was amazing about it actually was that it only stood in London for a month, and we had so many complaints from the client. And the client of this is something that London does. It has a privatized public space, so it's owned by an estate. And this is public space where the only thing you can do in that public space is be a consumer. You can buy a latte, sure. You can sit there for 20 minutes. Stay longer, you're a weirdo. We need to make some money out of you. And the kind of public space that it was allowing was beautiful people arranged in beautiful conversation. There's no room for the ugly, the awkward, the argument, the drunk. There's no room for couples to be intimate, to have a fight. There's no room for any of the mess of groups of people to gather. People like to gather near buildings. They don't gather in the middle of empty public spaces. And so this used to become a place in the evenings where people came to drink. And the security guards hated it because they couldn't see them inside the building. And we thought it worked. And then it was dismantled and taken back to Ireland. And the boat builder who built the Quarry is now building a boat inside this building. But it was also an exercise in reference and trying to think about Hayjuk and the mask. There's a lot of attention being paid to Hayjuk based on form, which is cool, yeah, really interesting forms, but actually the fundamental idea of character in architecture on the mask as an urban inhabitant, as the event of architecture, is something that I think is probably more useful to pull from him and is worth thinking about. And we're compelled by people as well, like Kai Fisker, and figures in the city like Hornbeck House, which is what's called the kilometre style, which is this is a series of vast social housing projects built in Copenhagen in 1920 to about 1940. And what's interesting about Kai Fisker is that he was a functionalist, just as Corb was, But he had a completely different attitude to what functionalism was. And he said functionalism builds itself around the conditions of life, which should flow through it like a river. And he wanted to make pure white modernism, but because the budgets were so cheap and because the local building culture didn't make it available, he just worked with what was to hand. He worked with local window manufacturers, plaster, brickwork, and then he just manipulated them to make them amazing. I'm not going to show you very much about this building, they're worth going to see, but it was finished the same month as Vers une Architecture was printed. 2 theses about functionalism. One, disruptive, eager for a stylistic imposition. By the way, I love it, right? Corb. The other one, not written in a building, about not efficiency, about inefficiency, about human congregation, about things that are to hand and weaving something from this. Every single one of Kai Fisker's buildings is still used for its original purpose. They're still among the most popular social housing in the city of Copenhagen. Very few of Corbusier's social housing projects are social housing, and very few of the houses are lived in. I still love Corb, I love Fisker also. I'm interested in those impulses within architecture, the impulse to make do with what we have or to disrupt and dream. Frequently they need to live inside us in the same time. But just one talk about the Fisker thing was really all the architecture lies in the windows. And we did a series of drawings of these buildings with our students. The book is coming out in September. But on the right, you have a cross-section through the wall of these external facades and internal facades. And it's just in the calibration of the location of the windows that Fisker's architecture is made. And this was something that we were very cognizant of with the warehouse because we couldn't make any differences to the outside. And so all we did was place doors. The plastered wall was repaired, and we used a little motif that reminded us of Michelangelo, and we painted it silver. And that was how we made that facade. But what's really interesting about that is that that warehouse and the Red Pavilion, 2 of the smallest projects we've done, there was a town outside of Dublin that has no sewage treatment. So it was discharging its raw sewage into the sea. And there's an algorithm in Ireland that identifies the most efficient place to put a sewage treatment plant, for energy use. And it picked a really beautiful site. And so the engineers went to the national planning body and say, we're putting a sewage treatment site here between the sea and the river on this amazing piece of land. And the planning body said, you're going to need an architect. And an architect has never been involved in the design of a wastewater treatment plant in Ireland or even in Europe, as far as I know. And the engineers had no idea what architects were. There was 27 specialisms like tunneling engineers, wave engineers, all these people, bioreactor designers. They didn't know any architects. So they put together a list, and they were pretty good. Like, they put some good people on the list. They put Grafton Architects, O'Donnell and Toomey, but they had decided they needed 8. And they got through a list, they added some bad commercial firms, and then there was 1 slot left. And it was just like, well, they're not going to get the job, so who will we put on the list? The head of Arabs had been in London and seen the Red Pavilion the week before. And he said, there's these guys, Clancy Moore, Steve Larkin, they did this Red Pavilion, I don't know, we talked to them? And then somebody said, no, we can't go to 3 firms that haven't worked together before. And somebody else lived on this street and said, I know Clancy Moore did this weird silver building, I was inside it, it's quite nice. And then a planner who works for the national water body was in the room, and she said, are you still talking about Clancy Moore? He said, yeah, I used to be the planner, and we gave them permission for a black house in a quarry 12 years ago, and it was great. So we got on the shortlist. Total random chance. And I think what's really interesting about architecture, one of the things that produces anxieties is that when you get into practice, it's silent. You're making work, you don't know if it's good or bad, you're trying your best, but the world isn't responding to you because it can't. That's actually very healthy. Like, I work in Dublin where you're not noticed. Europe doesn't look there, or at least didn't. And that's lovely because you can make a lot of mistakes, failures, nobody's judging you, it's brilliant. Then I also work in London where every single damn thing people do has to be analysed and scrutinised, and it feels much more tense to me in London. I like the anonymity of architecture until you're ready not to be anonymous, and I don't think it's a race. I don't really subscribe to mythologies of youth in architecture. I'm much more interested in stories of longevity. But the sewage treatment plant is now on site, 120 million. The internal area of the buildings that we're making is 3 hectares. There's 7 windows. Oh, I like that, like 3 hectares of space and 7 windows. But this is all based on the way we won the competition was that we came into the interview panel with a representative of each of the 27 specialisms that were designing this water treatment plant, and we were the only one that didn't show design. What we said we were going to do was we were going to sit with them for 6 months and watch what they did. And then we started to stack the tanks into buildings, and now we've made a big campus. It's on site. I'm not going to take you through it in any depth, but it all comes from an idea of wrapper and facade and thinking about this. So the sewage treatment plant is being designed so that they can change the full interior as much as they want, and that the exterior would then be this veil that hides it, because the technology evolves so fast in water treatment that it's constantly changing. So they like to go low and they like to go with tanks. But here the planners wanted civic form. And then we wanted a building that felt a little bit like a child's drawing, that up close it could be seen as detail, and from distance it could feel like cartoon. And we were obviously thinking, about, it's come to me, Copenhagen civic architect did all that amazing power plants, Hansen, who did, and we were thinking about this kind of modest background, cheap civic architecture. And we knew that the contractor who built this water treatment plant wasn't going to be spending 120 million on the architecture. It was going to be in the tunneling, the wave defenses, the bioreactors. So we went, the way you can protect the architecture is that you make it the cheapest thing in the building. So they try and save money in the tunneling, they try and save money in the wave defenses, but they don't attack the architecture because there's too little money there, and it's actually working that way. And we learned all this from the Quarry project, because after the Quarry project, Colm did this drawing, which was a critique of what we had done. So it's different. It's a redrawing of the Quarry project facade, where you can see it's no longer so classical. The bottom has been dropped off. It's become layered. And we did it because the Quarry project has a 100-year design life. But if we'd done this, the facade would have had a 150-year design life. But we didn't because of architectural language. And his critique was really to talk about, if you think carefully about things, you don't have to be so held by the image of the thing you're trying to make. And I think this is where I'm going to come to concluding the lecture, which is that this is how we work. So we don't really get, those pictures of, like, one of the amazing things about architecture is that you can't do it on your own. It's just impossible. So we're not artists, we're not novelists, we're not those people. We have to work with others. Most of us, even if we have our own practice, work in partnership. And yet we're trained pretty much in most of the universities to work apart, to work on our own, which is really quite odd for a discipline that can only work together. And we don't really buy those photographs of architecture practices with people smiling, they're all holding pencils. It's beautiful. That is terrible mythology, like. And because it says like that, hey, if it's not effortless, it's not good. This isn't a good fit. Like, we have arguments, sure we do. We fights, yeah, we do. And not because of our idea versus other ideas, but about expectations, insecurities, the human thing, right? And this is how we work. This is a drawing of how we work, because it's just one of the sketches that was on our desk. Colm is sitting at the table this way, and I'm sitting this way. I'm messy. I draw with a 6B pencil. Colm is much more collected, and he draws with very fine ink pens. And we don't see the world the same way. And that's good. And we draw the same thing in entirely different ways. And that's also good. And we're not interested in abstraction in finished form. We're interested in abstraction to help you think. We're interested in things that are contingent and contested and ambiguous and human, and stories that other people might tell of them, not of our making. And I'm going to close with the story about architecture as we think it is today. And this is like, it's one of my favorite photographs. I talk about it a lot, and I wrote an essay about it, about architecture and about criticality in architecture. And it's a photograph taken, the Columbia space shuttle was re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and it disintegrated. And what NASA did was they gathered all the fragments from across the continental United States and Canada, from playgrounds, from backyards, from roadsides, from city squares, from fields. And they took them all together to this warehouse. And they were placed where they were before the shuttle broke up. And then something started in the room, and it was a conversation. And there's a few things happening here. The first thing is that this is a memorial. 7 people died. It's also a memorial to a certain kind of belief in progressive science. And it's more than that. It's an investigation. Things have been gathered together. There are people here. When you look at the photograph from this distance, you don't see the people, but there are people all through this. And they're looking at the things. And they're experts. And they're trying to think about what those things had in relationship to one another. And they're remembering the successes that put those things there. They're remembering the decisions that placed those things there. But they're aware of something profound that went wrong. So success and failure are both present. And the future is present. Because you don't gather like this unless you are dreaming about what comes next. But if you're not being clear about the successes and failures that have come before you, both in your own career and in our discipline as a whole, you cannot make a future. And if you feel diminished by acknowledging failure, then you're not able to act with your full human intelligence. And if you are only compelled by the blind belief in the progressive success, further mistakes lie ahead. And yet you have to act at all points aware that you will be making mistakes and good decisions every day of the rest of your career. And what's beautiful about this for me in architecture is that that is not a diminishment. That is human intelligence in operation. What is architecture then? This thing that we all dreamed up as a discipline 400 years ago, that we retrospectively mapped onto millennia, that has now embraced every cultural tradition, so that we're looking at vernacular architectures from Accra, we're looking at territorial architectures from Chile, we're looking at the human inhabitation in its widest form. Architecture isn't a canon of knowledge. It's not European. Architecture is the making and remaking of the human habitat. Architecture is what happens when you stop thinking purely about practicality and you start to inflect at the limits to do with beauty. One of the things that Vitruvius got right in the 3-card Monty, as Tom de WOJR calls it, of utilitas, firmitas, venustas, right? That is correct. Anytime you see human culture pause to think about the making of a building, anytime the wealth accretes to that point, anytime there's room in culture for that to happen, architecture spontaneously happens. And it happens in vernacular brick walls, in stone walls, in sheds, in gardens, in houses, in suburban lots, in city sites, in museums, in churches, in graveyards. Architecture is all of this, and the thinking that goes with this, and thinking about that thinking. And I think, therefore, the purest place that architecture is present is in a school, temporarily distilled, knowing that it needs to be reconnected with the fundamental contingency that makes it meaningful. And that's why I'm here, and that's why I made this lecture for you guys. So thanks a million. Cheers.
So, thank you. Any questions? Yeah.
I think that works, huh? Thanks really a lot for your lecture. I would even say it like it has this bold statement in the whole process that you had a kind of clear position, and also starting with criticizing Olgiati and pointing out this bottom-up culture to make architecture. I think it was really also inspiring for me to that the way you also psychologically described the life of an architect and then daily life and the practice. I think there was a lot of wisdom in this lecture actually. But as I stay on the other side of the screen, I want to make a provocative question. Because it seems to me, I mean, obviously I'm not so much experienced as you are, but in the daily life of an architect, or when I'm with people who are not architects, I barely confront people who can talk about space. When they think about architecture, actually, and also in your presentation, maybe it was, I mean, in German language, there is a difference between pillar and column. And you mentioned column many times and not pillar, because I think there is this structural way of thinking or spatial way of thinking in this architecture. And maybe in this way I'm a bit provocatively supporting Olgiati's point of view that like this negative thinking, it's hard to talk with clients about space. A lot easier to talk about windows or colors and materials. And I had the feeling like in your presentation, this knowledge of architecture was more focused on this structural way of thinking. But maybe to create a foundation of this question, like Bruno Sevi, as an architectural historian, like to take the architectural space, the starting point before all the other decisions of structural elements follow the space. But at first, the idea of space, which is for me often very hard to talk with people outside of the architectural domain. So I really wonder what you think about this, positive, negative question of like space and structural elements.
It's a really good question. Yeah, and like, because I like Olgiati's work. That's why I'll slag him off. Like, and I think that that's okay. I don't understand why. I've got friends who are movie makers, and and they make films that are like 100 million or whatever, and the critic will condemn them. Architects make buildings for 2 million, 10 million, and they get so hurt if somebody doesn't like their building. I don't understand it. I really don't. But the question about autonomy versus implication and space versus assembly, they're not binaries, they're interwoven. And maybe the way to talk about it from my perspective is that you can't really talk about space in a lecture because it's frame-based, and so you will talk to that. The form of representation one uses changes how you talk. It's kind of natural. When we talk to clients about space, we tend not to call it space. We tend to ask for feelings. And what we're finding, actually, it's quite unusual because all of our clients have been quite intimately connected with us in that you become friends with them so you can have very safe conversations, like with a married couple or a family about what it's like to wake up in a room or what kind of, what feeling in the morning they're looking for, and then you can talk about feelings. And actually, those feelings are much more interesting. Like, it's interesting that in architecture, say, the Pantheon has stood for 2,000 years, and yet we don't have a word for the feeling of passing through that strange portico into that space. Now, it's a causal reference that we all use. Everybody knows it, right? I'm just using that one, but we could use any others. What we talk about as architecture is, the Pantheon, and then we talk instantly about feeling. That way? We don't talk about space. And I think that's because space is only present when it's felt. So I'm interested in spatial feelings as a lexicon. And when you switch to that, you find it very present. And then to go to the point of assembly, yeah, that's true, because it has its own agency. As soon as you connect with the material and start thinking about it, it starts to happen that way. But if I was an architect in 100 years' time, the things that the building industry are providing to me will be different. And I will assemble differently. I'm implicated. So no theoretician, no matter how good a writer, has affected architecture as much as the firms that invented plasterboard. Like, no theoretician has changed architecture as much as the invention of the extruded section, right? So these things are causally linked. And yet we can think critically and theoretically about the products of these things. We have to. So that's what I mean about rejecting like the claim of non-referential, even if you want to do. It's like saying, I choose not to breathe. You know, yeah, you can do that for a while, but then it will become a problem. And the question would be that I don't know what use it serves students or the discourse. I think that that's my critique of it. I think what it does is it makes an architect look important. But I don't think it helps anybody else be a better architect. And then what's the point? What are we getting from that conversation? That's my critique of non-referential architecture. It seems fundamentally selfish and aggrandizing when, sure, but we all know he's a great architect. So what? That's not the point. The point is, what do we get from you while you're alive that help us be better at what we do? That's what it's about, because this is architecture, because it's human to human. And if your work is not shared in that sense, then I think you might be a very beautiful architect and people will learn from your buildings, but they might be disempowered by your teachings. They might become less able as architects in certain settings. And I'm very interested in enabling, like that you go, all of you should be in the discipline, like the whole part of you. I remember in first year feeling that I should be embarrassed about places I grew up in and places that I'd been. And now I realize all those things were fundamentally part of my architectural knowledge base. And it's not talked about, it is talked about a lot, but it shapes us, like it absolutely shapes us. Do you know what I mean? I could go on, but won't bore you all. And we've got David over here, right? There you go, ready to go. So we might, there's probably no more questions, is there? Oh. Do I choose my clients? No. So the question was, do you choose your clients? No, so I grew up really poor. So we need to make a living from architecture. Most of us do. Some don't. But both are very valuable additions to the subject. For us, we've never said no to a single project, ever. We can't. And we have to survive. Architects don't pick their clients most of the time. They get picked by chance initially, by family and friendship, by odd encounters in pubs, by magazines seen, by chats. What's lonely about architecture is that there's been people talking about you and you don't have a feckin' clue. Because and then the phone rings just when you're about to shut down the practice and somebody asks you to do something. That's happened twice to us, where we're just going, this is not working, there's no work, we've been sitting here, we can't pay the rent, we're not paying ourselves, we're paying our staff, this makes no sense. And the phone rings the next day and somebody's asking you to do something. So no, we can't. And I also think that architecture as a livelihood where you don't pick, where you can't control, might produce more interesting journeys, because it's very scary, but it's quite fun when you look back at it and went like climbing a difficult rock face. Oh yeah, okay. That was a big mistake over there. We nearly got sued. But and you all will nearly get sued and get sued. But that's okay. That's okay. That's why we've got insurance. But I think that the point is here that we have to, well, it's true. No architect talks about when they're sued. But I made a lecture series in one of the schools where architects in a safe space would come in and talk about when they were sued. And it was almost everybody I knew. And it was like a therapy. And we should be okay about that, I think. But that's what happens when you don't pick your clients. You get into these situations, and sometimes they're amazing. And sometimes, they're dead ends,
Short break, okay? Thank you.